Good morning, fellas, and boy,
Morning.
special greeting to Dave this morning. Of course, some of us were talking ahead of time, but Dave, we're so glad to have you back, and glad you're on the mend after your
Yeah, give Tim my best next
encounter.
time
So,
you talk to him.
what's that?
Give Tim my best next you talk to him.
Yeah, yep, I will. I could. I think Tim is. Well, Tim is 60. He turned 60 in 2020 because I actually went to his birthday party. But I could tell on the phone. I could tell his voice on the phone. I could tell the weakness in his voice, but he's on the mend and coming back. So, well, let's get started. We're in, as you are well aware, the Gospel of John, and review. Let's jump into what we've been looking at, verses 53 through 58. We've looked at it. I think we spent 3 weeks on this section. And again, to state that it is the most controversial section in the entire book of what is Jesus talking about here has been interpreted a number of different ways, primarily polarized. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it all centers around the Eucharist language that he's using within the text. So anyway, we've looked at those verses. And from last week, we learned that Jesus is offering a union, what I'm calling, I mean, it's not exclusive to me, but I'm calling union is what he's inviting these people into. Life, union, relationship is what Jesus is talking about. And this relational union is an extension of his relational union with the Father. And so the diagram shows, I think in images, so I naturally try to diagram ideas, and this is the diagram that I've used. Jesus is coming from the Father, has come from the Father. He states that several times within the gospel itself. He says, I have come from the Father and I'm returning back to the Father. And in other places, he says he's living in the now with the anticipation of the hour. That term, the hour that he is moving towards the cross is coming. So he's from the Father, he's going back to the Father, and he's living in this time now within the gospel account as he's anticipating the hour that is coming. This same union is extended to all who will eat, and that's primarily Jesus's audience, all who will eat, which is synonymous with this union, which is synonymous with belief. So that's where we looked at last week. And what I'm proposing, guys, is a mouthful here, and it really has some very, very important ramifications of where our beliefs lie. I'm talking about here, what I'm proposing in this diagram is that the Father, Jesus, and all who believe is one relationship. That has some ramifications, and I'm aware of what I am talking about here. All are invited to participate. It touches on the idea of the divine. To what degree does the human being carry the image of the divine? And this is that's a controversial subject, but from the text itself, at least my understanding is that Jesus is talking about this extension of the divine relationship being offered and extended to all who will eat. And that is that's a mouthful. And puts our heads to some degree on tilt. All are invited to eat. Participation is initiated through belief. That is how this invitation is enacted. And belief is described here as ingesting the true food and the true drink. Fortunately, I didn't have any sound effects with that dropping of the bogey, but this, guys, when he drops this, ingesting, I eat my flesh and drink my blood, it creates all havoc in this group, and it creates havoc in our heads, in our contemporary context as well. What is he talking about? And so I'm identifying that whatness, that confusion in a sense, as a bogey. And so we are now, we got a bogey. We're dealing with a bogey. And now in verse 59, this is new. And the text reads, we're going to look at one verse before we move on into verse 60. But these things, John writes, he inserts now, these things Jesus said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. That is new. That's a whole new thing. And I don't want to pass it up. I think that's an important detail. He was teaching this in a synagogue in Capernaum. However, there has been no mention of synagogue up until this point. Now, before we dive into this verse, I pulled some references out of chapter 6 within the context itself, within the story, that I think have bearing on this idea of where this took place, or at least a portion of it. We know from verse 4, early on in the text, right at the beginning of the chapter, that what is occurring at the time of the Passover, the Passover event. And we've already identified within the story portions of the Passover story that are in the center of the conversation, that being the manna, the bread from heaven. That it really is enacting, Jesus is only responding to what the crowd is bringing up about this idea of the manna. So we know it's Passover. We know it's the time when the people of Israel are remembering about deliverance into freedom, deliverance out of the tyranny of rule, and to be brought towards to the promised land with, unfortunately, a 40-year detour. But that's another story. Another reference, 6:24. The crowd saw that Jesus was not there. Okay, that's over near Tiberias on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And this goes back early on. They have been fed by Jesus. And the next morning, they're looking, where is Jesus? And they can't find him in the area. And doing some intel, they discovered that he took a boat and went across over to Capernaum. We've already looked at that portion of the text. And so they pirated some boats, and I assume they did, and they paddled across the northwestern section of the Galilee over to Capernaum. And in their mind, when they meet up with Jesus, they're seeking a sign. There's something here, and we want to validate you, Jesus. So give us a sign. And that's where Jesus said, you guys are here for an entirely different reason. You are here because you were fed. And this ties in with the whole language that he uses about being drawn by the Father. And so that has bearing. Verse 6:45. Now Jesus is speaking, and he quotes from the prophets, or at least alludes to the prophets, and where he says, quote, "And they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." So these are three references that have bearing. How do they have bearing? First of all, there is no prior mention of the synagogue. What we can derive is that either the crowd found Jesus, and it says when they found him in verse 25, either they found him already in the synagogue, and we're speculating, or they found him in the street or some other place, and during the time of the interaction, they moved the group to the synagogue. You know, I don't think it matters, but at least we know a portion of what Jesus taught was within the confines of the local synagogue. And you and I ask, well, you're asking me, why is that so important? Well, let's take a look. We're filling in some gaps here. Secondly, we know from verse 4 that all this is taking place at the time of the Passover, which is already stated. That's important because that has bearing on the synagogue. And lastly, we know that during his discourse, Jesus references the prophets. And here's the quote, "And they shall all be taught of God," verse 45. And and then I wrote, although not direct quotes, if you Google that, I don't see that as a direct quote out of the Old Testament, but he is alluding to at least a couple of Old Testament citations, one from the 8th century, Isaiah 54:18, 8th century before Christ, where it states, all your sons will be taught of the Lord, looking at in a prophetic sense to the future, all your sons will be taught of the Lord. And of course, at that time, the channel for teaching would have been the priestly channel of the Levites out of the first temple. And synagogue did not exist at that point in Isaiah in the 8th century. The temple had not been destroyed yet. And so that was a very, what is this going to look like? There's a prophetic statement here spoken from the 8th century. And then later in the 6th century, Jeremiah, near the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, destruction of the temple, Jeremiah writes, "For this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws within them and write it on their heart, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." That is an important phrase. It's called the Tripartite Blessing, and it's throughout all of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It is the promise that I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of them. Jesus only states a portion of that tripartite blessing, which is repeated, but that's an important citation. They will not teach again, each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me. All know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wrongdoings, and their sin I will no longer remember. That's out of Jeremiah 31, just right at and near the time of the destruction of the temple. Jesus now, 1st century AD, alludes to those texts. Now, let's talk about synagogue, the practice and the purpose. The term synagogue, Greek origin, means to bring together. Now, did you ever notice in the Old Testament, you don't have synagogues? Their center, their locus of worship was the temple. They would migrate, they would come to the temple. And this occurred, the idea of synagogue occurred out of need after the destruction of the temple in 586, during what's called the intertestamental period. They had to figure out how to meet. Gathering is important. As we know in the 21st century AD, gathering is important. And so they had to figure out, and that term is called reframing. They had to reframe how they were going to express their faith in some manner. And the outcome of that was the development of the synagogue. You know, at the close of the Old Testament, you don't see it. And then, and all of a sudden you read Matthew in the book of Matthew in the first century, you go, well, where did this come from? Well, that's where it came from. And it means to bring together. So this coming together in the synagogue was and still is to this day for the purpose of worship. In a sense, it was a plan B to the coming to the temple, because they couldn't go to the temple. And it was for worship. So, however, like all worship assemblies, including us in our modern day Christianity, all expressions of worship, synagogue had its own order of practice defining what worship means. If you and I would go on a field trip and visit each other's churches, we would find a slightly different order of worship. And that order of worship is, in a sense, a definition of how each expression, each congregation defines what worship looks like in a congregational sense. And synagogue had its specific order as well. Synagogue order of service is characterized by group prayer and the reading of the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament scriptures. The most important place within the synagogue structure itself. Now, let me back up. Synagogue takes place everywhere. They are more today like house churches. Now, that's not entirely true. There are some very ornate, established structures that are synagogues, large structures. But when Sandra and I lived in Jerusalem for a summer, there was a synagogue right around the corner in a house, in an upper flat. They had synagogue. And I'll tell you a little bit of another story in just a minute. But synagogue, if you were walking the streets on Saturday night after sundown, you were in different residential districts of Jerusalem, you could hear the singing going on in the synagogue of the various parts of the city. The most important place within the synagogue structure is the Aaron Kodesh. And that's a Hebrew word that means holy ark. And what this is generally a cabinet of some sort. It's a cabinet that houses the synagogue's hand-copied Torah scroll. Every synagogue has a hand-copied Torah scroll that has been, and they're all supposed to be exactly alike. That is that's the work of a scribe. When we were sitting in our flat one night in Jerusalem, and we heard a commotion out in the streets, singing and dancing. It was like a parade. And what it was a scribe had just finished completion of a Torah scroll, a new one, and it was being paraded to its housing in the local in the local synagogue in the Aaron Kodesh, and it was being taken to the synagogue where it was to rest and remain during its entire life. And so it is a very celebrated event. There's also, and then also I'll say that in some synagogues I've visited historically, that this Aaron Kodesh is actually a room. And it all represents the Holy of Holies. It's the holy place for God's word. And in some cases, it's a cabinet. In some places, it's a room. And in those places, the rabbi will go into the holy room, disappear out of view, and bring in the scroll to be read at the desk, the holy scriptures to be read. And do you get the idea? Like this is really important. And they read from that scroll every synagogue gathering.
Mike?
Yeah.
Do they still write them as scrolls, or do they use codex or books for the reading there?
My understanding, I'm 20 years removed from when I was in Israel, but my understanding, I did some work on the internet, is that every synagogue has a handwritten scroll.
The rolled scroll.
A rolled scroll, yeah. And they have the exact number of words. There's actually a number, 6,000 and some words that are hand scribed. So I could be wrong, but that's my understanding.
Okay.
And it really has that understanding has bearing on how holy the Torah scroll is in thinking of the Orthodox, those practicing Judaism today. So we've talked about the role of synagogue, and so now this is what it's like then for the parishioners, the participants, to go to synagogue. And so, first of all, when you go to synagogue, like we go to our places of worship, there is an anticipation of a prescribed order. All of us on this call, in this meeting, have been conditioned to what to expect at church. And okay, you're nodding no. Let me finish, and then I'll let you comment. An anticipation of prescribed order. So, and I'm not going to try to guess, Dave, what you're going to comment on it, and that's fine. So, as we participate within this prescribed order, we then go through the prescribed order, whatever it is, and this prescribed order may be a loosely held thing, but it's a fulfillment of an expectation that we are going through. Steve Schoening and I and Mike Melander actually were raised in a tradition that every week we had a special gathering that maybe most of you have never attended, but it was an unstructured worship time. And the whole idea of it was to be unstructured because structure was bad. And so we specifically made it unstructured, but that unstructured was really a structure. And so we would go and we would participate in this, and oftentimes people were, and only the men could verbally participate, and there would be these long periods of silence, and a man would get up and read out of the scriptures or pray or suggest that we read a song, and it was all in this sense of worship, and it was very beautiful. It's a holy event. But in so doing, the framework of which we were thinking of is we were doing it the way God prescribed us to do it. And you would often hear men say, "And Lord, thank you that we are meeting in God's appointed way." That was a key phrase, is that we were the ones that were, in an unstructured sense, meeting the way people were supposed to meet. We were doing it the right way. And every week, this was bolstered within us as we participated in it. So as we left that meeting, we were reinforced in our anticipated prescribed order. We were reinforced with the idea. We walked out and we go, well, we met in God's appointed way. And I am not critical at all of what we did. It was an actually beautiful thing, but it also became very ritualistic. And over time, it became an illusion of what we start, in my opinion, lost the purpose in the sense of the unstructuredness and thinking we were doing God's way the whole time. That's the best I can state it right now. In the center of our tradition was the idea of worship, that we are all priests, we all anticipate, or we're all active, except we interpreted all priests as only men, because we were carrying out a specific order that the woman is in a place of support and the men are to lead, but yet we were all priests. That's how our heads were working. And the center of the center of that meeting was the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And so instead of Torah scroll, we would have the Lord's Supper in the middle. In the synagogue sense, there, everything is the expression of worship, but everything is centered around the Holy Scriptures. The Holy Scriptures, the guys, quite frankly, the getting it right, the carrying it down to the jot and the tittle. So this is a pattern. There's an anticipation, there's a participation, and through that participation, we are reinforced to then create further anticipation, to again create further participation, all in a prescribed order, to then get reinforced, to then, and it goes round and round and round and round. Guys, this is not a criticism. This is the way it is, at least from my perspective. So Dave, comment. You were shaking your head no, so.
Well, shaking my head, had the discussion before when you said we've all grown up or become accustomed to a certain procedure or process that we go through. Well, of course I'm in that midst. I grew up Episcopalian. What other kind of order of service type thing is there as a prime example? But basically what I was trying to shake my head about is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Jews have the Word in the Torah, but they're so focused on the Word that they're missing their God. When they wandered in the wilderness in the tabernacle, God appeared. God was there. God manifested himself through the cloud, through the manna, and these kinds of things. What we've done with our prescribed orders of things is we become so focused on the process that we've forgotten the purpose. And the purpose of worship is to seek the very presence of God himself. And aside from that, anything that we do is not necessarily bad, but it's not what we're supposed to be about. To facilitate the intimacy that he wants with us, our purpose in gathering together, or as far as that goes, our purpose in individual prayer, is to plead for and seek his very presence. And when his presence comes, my order of service goes out the window.
Yeah. Well, Dave, thanks for sharing that. And I couldn't agree more. So yeah, Bill, you're raising your hand on Zoom. What a cool.
I've had fun reading a book. I can't remember the name of the Crucible of Faith during that time, but two or three things. One is in all this self-introspection that the Jews went through and in Babylon, wondering what have we done wrong, what's going on and stuff. And one of the things that, well, it was idolatry that got us cast out of the land, and we need to return to the Word of God. And of course, that's not when they first wrote these books, but that's when they first compiled them and put them together. The Septuagint came out of that period, and the idea of that was pretty holy to them. But when they returned and built the temple, there's still something really missing here, and that's the presence of God, which was represented by the ark. I mean, the ark's disappeared. And I always wondered how they made peace with that, that we got a temple, we got our sacrifices, but there's no ark,
Right,
and that was interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. And I'm calling that interesting reframing. They reframed their way of doing it. Note that when the second temple was built under Ezra, and then expanded during the first century, Herod's temple, the temple that is in place during our story that will be destroyed in 70 AD, the second temple, during this time, there's a temple. There's a temple that is beyond all temple imagination. But note that the Jewish expression of faith, they didn't drop the synagogue. The synagogue is still there, and it is very alive. This is where it happens. And so, Bill, the only answer to your question, it has to be reframing. And, on a side note here, at no extra charge, is that, there's a lot of discussion out there, right now under this world pandemic. We just got to get back. For what it's worth, we are never going to get back. We have changed. We have reframed what relationship now looks like. Now, it definitely there be changed. There will be as we all become vaccinated and the herd thing happens, and there will be. We're not going to be where we are now. But guys, I propose to you that we have all changed and be through reframing. We're in the midst of reframing right now in a profound sense. The church reframing. Our reframing is what relationships look like now from here on out. And of course, we'll start to, restaurants will probably start opening again and all that. But my point is we can't deny what has happened to us as a world society. There is, in my opinion, no such thing as getting back. We only can move forward from here because we've been changed. So that, for what it's worth. So let's, Dave.
Plus, Indiana Jones is still looking for the ark.
Okay, all righty. Now, put yourself in their shoes now as we look at this. Again, our discussion this morning is, why did this happen in the synagogue? So put yourself as a first century Jewish worshiper, and you are walking with Jesus, or listening to him within the context of what I have just explained. They're in worship, or they're in synagogue. Jesus does two things within this context of synagogue. Again, there's this word reframing. He reframes the manna story that they brought up. The crowd first referenced the story in verse 31 as justification for a sign to authenticate Jesus's message. They were using this story as a proof text to get Jesus to authenticate who he was so they could allow him into their world. Isn't that a hoot? This story, that was their intent. This story ties directly to the Passover season, which they are in within the story. The manna story describes God's miraculous provision during the Exodus journey. We know that. Jesus takes this story and he draws correlation to his offer. He's just piggybacking on what they brought up. And then he states, remember, bread from heaven, it wasn't Moses, folks, that gave you the bread, it was the Father. And by the way, the bread that I offer you, bread from heaven, I am the bread from heaven. And if you eat the bread that I offer, it'll give you eternal life, not temporary. Jesus cites this story, drawing correlation to his offer. He then states the absolute superiority of his offer over what occurred in the wilderness. That's how he reframes the manna story. And secondly, he reframes the two Tanakh references out of the prophets. In so doing, he transports the core truth of these texts into the now. What this gives us insight, guys, is not only, we've got this idea, at least I was raised with this idea. We look at the text and we try to say, what is God saying, like a rule book? And what I'm proposing here is that not only the Jewish people actually reframed their manner of worship for the first century, for the synagogue, but Jesus is taking these texts and reframing the meaning and bringing the core teaching of those meanings into the now. And he did that with the manna story, and then he references these two Old Testament prophets, bringing that text into the now. And you'll be hearing, in order for us to understand this story, we need to introduce this term reframing, or we're going to be super confused. So now continue putting yourself into the shoes of these folks. Every time you're in a synagogue, just like every time you step into the sanctuary of your place of worship, you know the smells, you know the sounds, you know there is a feeling that is attributed to that space that's familiar. You know this familiar space. And it's within that context that Jesus is delivering this teaching. So there's an anticipation inside of you of what this is to be about. Oh, we have a guest lecturer today. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. Let's hear what he has to say. But in the midst of this environment of prescribed order, Jesus drops a bomb. This bomb is this bogey that he just throws out in the middle of the structure, and it's what I'm calling disorder. Jesus induces, we have a new kitty that's helping me teach this morning. Jesus is inducing disorder in this place of prescribed order. And this disorder, we have yet to read what the effect is going to be on this, guys. Where actually the disciples himself are shaking their heads. What is going on? And that what is going on is disorder. And as a result, the outcome is a perplexing and troubling state of mind for many in attendance. The many, not all. I didn't use all, but I just used many. This perplexing and this troubling state of mind. And where I'm going to go with this next week is that this is all part of the process, and it's what creates growth. This process. Verse 60, we'll look at that next week, where the disciples are scratching their heads and saying, this is a hard to accept statement. And this hard to accept statement is disorder. So we've got about 10 minutes. And rather than going to table time, let's do it as a group, as a full group. And can you guys think of a time in your journey where you experienced a perplexing and troubling state of unknowing, a period of time where your prescribed thought of how life ought to be, how Christianity ought to be, how a faith journey ought to look like was absolutely exploded? And can you tell us a story? Let's hear some stories. What was it like?
Mike, I don't know if it's necessarily in the context of church, or my spiritual life, but 4 years ago I got divorced after 30 years of being married, and that changed everything.
Yes.
More than I could imagine it would, because it wasn't it wasn't an event. I spoke to counselors about it. Had it been a matter of I'm an alcoholic and my wife got fed up and left, and I can kind of see that coming, and yeah, I guess I would too. Or if I found her unfaithful and cast her out.
Reason, yeah.
But there was no event. It was just that we grew apart, and finally it just came to the point where I don't think we're going to do this anymore. And she decided, bravely so, I almost commend her for it, that we really shouldn't be married anymore. This is just not going anywhere.
Uh-huh.
But that wasn't in my family history. My parents weren't. Nobody in my family, I don't know if they were happy, but they certainly never took the plunge and got divorced. So I didn't know anybody that got divorced. Nobody in my family got divorced. I was the first one. And certainly in the church I was in, people didn't get divorced, and they looked at it as failure, as like, let's it's almost like a Job's miserable comforters, what have you done wrong? You must have done, let's go look back and find out where the mistake was.
Oh.
Like that matters,
Yeah.
And so it definitely changes your framing of how life should be. But what I walked away with was and I don't know if this is rationale, I hope it's not.
This is a great story. This is what we're talking about, Ben. Yeah.
Is that the one solid thing in my life that always was, still is, my relationship with God. I got to share that relationship with my spouse, but when she was no longer my spouse and kind of changed hats from being my wife to my sister in Christ kind of thing, God was always the constant. He never changed. My relationship with him didn't change. My thoughts of him didn't change. I was very disappointed, with the way my day-to-day life wasn't what I planned on at all. But when I get, in the quiet of my solitude, as they say, it's like really not that much is different. God is still my God, and Jesus is still my Savior. I still know where I sit in his mind. I'm doing it, it's individually now, rather than as a Aquila and Priscilla kind of doublet, but so it was a big change, but it wasn't, it didn't end everything for me.
Do you have children?
I don't.
Okay. Yeah.
That certainly would have changed the complexity of it all, but we never had children for medical reasons. She had cancer as a teenager, and we never had children, and that just wasn't part of who we were. But as far as your identity, if you think of yourself as a married Christian man, and you think of that as what you were going to be one day, and then you were that for 30 years, and then suddenly you're not. I mean, it's just like drive to DIA and it's over.
Yeah.
And it's like, now who the hell am I? You know, what's this all about?
Yeah.
And you got to come to grips with what's real. And for me, I found great comfort in the reality that God doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't change. You know, my view of life changed. My framing, as you said, changes. But who I am, at least in God's eyes, hasn't changed at all. And I'm working to believe that,
Yeah.
more and more without the confirmation of another person staring at me.
That's a perfect story, Vince. And I really appreciate you stepping out to share that. Thank you.
So, Mike, I was trying to frame it in terms of our faith journey. And Vince, I could ask you 10 questions, but just, how that divorce actually impacted and impacts today your faith journey. But when I got diagnosed with cancer, years ago, it really forced me to live a day at a time and to view the things that were important in life in the present, as opposed, just to value the things, just a reframing of just life, right? The things were important, how important was work, so I hear you say that a lot, but that was, that was a big thing in the journey.
Yeah, good. Thanks, John. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I had gone through Presbyterian out into the world, dropped my whole Christian thinking, had an event that turned me around, came in through the evangelical or the Baptist, E-Free Church, essentially, then ended up at the Vineyard, but had a residual, like, bad taste in my mouth for the mainline churches. They weren't preaching the true gospel, et cetera, et cetera. And when I go back to the lake in the summertime there, the default church up there was a Lutheran church. And they also are in conjunction with a church camp that's very vibrant. We're going a long time up in the area located on the lake. And we would go to the services. It was a big A-frame, big timber A structure where it was shut down the winter. There was no heat, but it kept you from getting rained on. It was really cool. And as I got into the liturgy there's a lot of singing. I got to know, I initiated a men's group, and of course it got taken over, rightfully so, by the pastor. We became good friends. The choir up there would be the church staff on the weekend. And I realized how totally infused they were with Christ. I mean, they were just so centered on it. And so was his preaching. And obviously I said, Bill, you bigot, I started finding Christ in the places that kind of was told he's not supposed to be there, and even when I was helping out an agency in Fort Collins, they want to come in for help. You say, well, there's this list of churches we think you should plug into that'll help you. And I looked at that list, and it was, if you look very carefully at it, it was obvious. It was a list of, as we would quote them, evangelical churches, and there's a lot of missing on there. And I'm reframing a lot of that now. I mean, Christ is absent a lot of times in a lot of evangelical. He's present in a lot of it doesn't get cut. It's not that clearly cut and divided. And I know the pastor up there, he went to seminary specific for rural areas, knowing those churches were dying, but he wanted to go serve in that area. And fortunately, up at the lakes, one of the few rural churches that's thriving. But the point is, it totally reframed my horizon. Just blew wide open after that, and I'm very more ecumenical than I used to be.
Yeah.
I had an experience before I was a believer, actually, with my stepkids getting into drugs. And so that introduced me to a whole area, mainly of the 12-step program. So initially we got into a 12-step program called Families Anonymous, and then we eventually got into, when I became a believer, into Celebrate Recovery, which is another 12-step program that's Christian based. But anyway, for me, it was actually, I think, a step towards me being able to believe in and accept, God as my maker and my savior.
Yeah. Yeah. Through the teaching of the 12-step program.
Yeah, because, most of them are, centered on turning things over to God or to superior. The ones that are more not Christian based will refer them just as a higher power type of a thing.
Yeah. Good.
But there is that concept of a higher power that you eventually get yourself into. So a constant thing that was in my mind, well, if I don't believe in Christ or God, what is my higher power? So
yeah. Well, thank you guys. It's 8:00, and Vince, thanks for leading out on the sharing, and for you other guys that jumped in there, and all very, very good stories and helpful to all of us. So thanks for sharing, guys. And when we go into verse 60, I'm having so much. I've been thinking about this now for several days. It's so interesting to me, this interaction, this perplexedness of the crowd, and not only the crowd, the disciples, those who have followed Jesus. And we're going to dive into next week, verse 60, and we're going to be looking at the remainder of the chapter over the next few weeks. And we've got some really interesting stuff to look at. So I'm anticipating, and we'll look forward to you. I'm anticipating a prescribed order. So we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. See ya. Bye.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
thank you.
Hi, y'all.